I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak here at the Sri Lankan TRIMS. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm Joanna Laurson-Doube. I'm an international consultant and I work with MS International Federation, and I will be discussing the ethical use of off-label disease-modifying therapies in MS. First, to introduce MSIF, we're a global network of national patient organizations. We have around 50 members. They range from large organizations such as the one in the US, the National MS Organization, to smaller ones, which might be mainly led by volunteers. In addition to our members, we liaise with another 50 countries where the organizations might be a lot smaller and might not meet membership criteria. So in total, our network is around 100 different organizations and countries. MSIF has 5 strategic aims, and the work that I will be discussing today will fit under the improved access to treatment and healthcare. But of course, a lot of our projects fit within a number of these different aims. And the off-label work, of course, also overlaps with the scientific aim, as well as the confident and informed decision-making, positive changes in attitudes, policies, and practices. There are 2 other things that I really wanted to emphasize before I share more of the off-label work. One is that all of the global work, really the need needs to be coming from the national setting. Similarly, when we have a global project, we need to implement it in the national setting as well. So there needs to be a constant dialogue really between us as well as the national MS organizations. The second one is that we are really promoting that the MS organizations work closely with healthcare professionals. And that's another reason why it's such a pleasure to be here today to talk to you. And I will be very happy to take any questions at the Q&A session afterwards, or I can be contacted later on as well. One of the flagship projects of MSIF is the Atlas of MS, which was updated in 2020. It has 2 different modules. One is around epidemiology, and the other one is around clinical management. The Atlas of MS is a questionnaire that is sent to country coordinators around the world, and then we collect and collate the data, and we make it available for everybody on our website. It can be downloaded in an Excel format, and it's extremely useful for global advocacy work when we work, for example, with the World Health Organization, and also for members and anyone else who would like to do any national advocacy. And I'd like to share some of the results that we had for disease-modifying therapies to give you an introduction to the off-label work. First of all, barriers for accessing DMTs is very common. Over 70% of countries report barriers for people with MS to access DMTs. Secondly, there is unequal access to DMTs. We have split the data both by income groups as well as the geographical regions. And what we can see is that in low-income countries, only around 30% of the countries have access to licensed DMTs. This is any licensed DMT for MS. And this actually is around 70% for low middle income countries as well. The problem is actually even worse when you're looking at the higher efficacy DMTs, as we have defined them here as alemtuzumab, natalizumab, and ocrelizumab. And what we can see there is that in low-income countries, none of the countries that replied to our survey had access to high efficacy DMTs. In lower middle income countries, this was 50%. When we were asking about the actual barriers that are stopping people from accessing DMTs, the most common reason that came forward was that it was too expensive for the government healthcare or insurance provider. And also, of course, for people with MS, out-of-pocket costs. So what can we actually do about this? So to tackle this, we formed our International Working Group on Access. They are set with the task of strategy development in order to look at the aim that I described earlier around access to treatment and healthcare. They will also start and develop different projects, which will be often spin out to a different committee or working group. The International Working Group has 24 members. We cover all of the World Health Organization world regions. We have people with MS, healthcare professionals, and MS organizations represented. The first project that this group really started with was that we applied for MS treatments to be added onto the WHO Essential Medicine List. Currently, there are no MS treatments listed, and we put together an application in 2018. Unfortunately, none of the DMTs that were proposed were actually listed, but we did get some very good feedback from the World Health Organization acknowledging the need for MS treatments to be listed. They asked for a revised application, which we plan to submit in 2022. As you can see, obviously it was very disappointed to not have any of the DMTs listed, but we did manage to really raise the awareness in terms of the issues relating to accessing DMTs with some nice publications, and also developing our relationships with the different neurological organizations as well as the World Health Organization. An additional feedback that came from the expert panel from the WHO was that we needed to consider also commonly used DMTs, and they specifically named Azathioprine and Rituximab. And as you probably know, these are off-label DMTs, and this really kind of sparked the work that I'm going to be describing now. So we put together a panel to look at off-label DMTs for MS. There are two clinical co-chairs. We have Professor Yamut and Dr. Viswanathan, and we also have a methodological chair, who is Professor Schoenemann. So why look at off-label DMTs? So as I described earlier on, of course, there are issues in terms of accessing on-label DMTs. And we had been requested by the World Health Organization to look at off-label DMTs as well. But the real crux here is that off-label DMTs may be much more available in health systems. And we actually looked at the World Health Organization National Essential Medicine List database, where 137 countries have submitted their national EMLs, and we analyzed them for DMTs that have been used either on label for MS or off label for MS. Now, most EMLs don't actually specify the indication, so we don't actually know if these countries are using these drugs to treat MS, but it is an indication around their availability. And as you can see here, it's probably too small for you to read, but the top one here is on-label DMTs, and 31% of the 137 countries listed one of these DMTs, at least one of these DMTs. However, when we looked at off-label DMTs, it was even higher, much more higher. It was 95%. So 95% of the 137 countries were listing at least one off-label DMT. From the Atlas of MS, we also looked at what DMTs the different countries were using. So on the left here, we have different drugs. We have blue, we have on-label DMTs, and yellow is off-label DMTs. And then at the bottom, we have the percentage of countries using that specific DMT to treat MS. And what we found was that off-label use was very common. The first yellow line here is for Rituximab. We have 70 different countries reporting its use. And the second yellow line is Azathioprine. We have 68 countries reporting using that. We don't actually know the scale of use of these drugs in the different countries. So you might have a country taking Azathioprine, for example, but they only have a few people on it, basically because they were started a long time ago. But nevertheless, the use is very common. So what we did was that we set up the MOLT panel, the MSIF off-label treatments panel. Again, to summarize the need, we needed to review these DMTs for the EML application for the World Health Organization. And also we recognized that because these DMTs were so widely used, there was some guidance needed. In terms of context, we wanted to focus on areas where there was a real need. So where the availability or affordability is stopping people from accessing a range of DMTs. And this was specifically chosen because of this issue around the high efficacy DMTs not being as widely available as the moderate efficacy DMTs. We took a very unbiased approach, of course, and the recommendations can be for or against. We would be looking, the panel would be looking at the evidence available. There would be panel discussions and there would be judgments based on those 2 points. The aims was really, there was 2 aims. One was to create a robust and transparent process for reviewing off-label DMTs. And then we would actually review the evidence for 2 specific off-label DMTs, Azathioprine and Rituximab. The idea is that this process could be used in the future to also look at other off-label DMTs if that was found to be useful, either by us or by other groups as well. So the first step was really to try and define some general principles for the ethical use of off-label DMTs. So we discussed these, and we have also received endorsement from a number of different organizations, including the World Federation of Neurology, the American Academy of Neurology, the European Academy of Neurology, as well as the regional TRIMS, ACTRIMS, ECTRIMS, MENACTRIMS, as well as PACTRIMS as well. And just to go through these briefly, the main principles that were identified was that off-label use of DMTs to treat MS should be driven by the need to protect people's health. The use should be evidence-driven and considered when on-label DMTs are not tolerated, unsuitable for the best clinical outcome, unavailable or unaffordable. Shared decision-making, again, especially important with off-label DMTs, and appropriate information to be available for people with MS. Outcomes, effectiveness, and adverse events should be carefully monitored, especially when using off-label DMTs. We also identified some long-term changes that were needed. First of all, we wanted to make sure that there would be evidence-driven clinical decision-making and reimbursement decisions. And so there was a need for guidelines. And this is what I will also discuss a bit further in the presentation. The second one was that the regulation of off-label prescribing in general for MS should be further considered and developed both nationally and internationally. Different countries are taking very different approaches to how off-label prescribing works in the different settings. And the third one is around regulatory agencies and other organizations should be developing measures to facilitate official registration for off-label use of medicines with a positive benefit-harm balance based on adequate evidence. And we have actually seen that both the FDA and the European, in the US, as well as the European medicine agencies, they're both looking at different pathways of actually piloting these kind of approaches of looking at repurposing and off-label use. So in terms of the guideline development, which is what we have been working for the last year or so, we first developed a guideline methodology, which has been published. We are working with the Cochrane MS group, as well as the Grade Center in McMaster University. I'm not going to go through all the details, but the idea very much was that we would be using systematic reviews, which are prepared by Cochrane. And then we will have the experts from the Grade Center looking at guiding the panel through bringing the evidence to a recommendation. This is called the evidence to decision framework. It's considered a kind of gold standard in terms of guideline development. And the idea is very much that there's a lot of transparency and structure in developing the recommendations. And they should also help when people are looking at the global guidelines and thinking about how they could be set up into the national setting. The protocols for the systematic reviews have been published on the Cochrane Library. You can access them. And actually the Rituximab systematic review has already been published as well. We're expecting for the Azathioprine systematic review to be published this year. Just to quickly summarize the Cochrane review for Rituximab, it included 15 studies, both RCTs and non-randomized control trials. They had around 16,000 participants for both relapsing MS as well as progressive MS. The key messages coming out from this review was that Rituximab may offer moderate to large effects on a range of other medicines in preventing relapses in multiple sclerosis. And this was compared with no medicines, the desirable effects would be even greater. There's also limited information to determine the effects of Rituximab for preventing disability, and serious harmful effects are relatively rare in people with MS. So it's very difficult to study, and they're also very not well reported in the different studies. So the panel used this information from the systematic reviews, going through the 12 different criteria for the evidence to decision framework. Again, they will cover all the normal aspects in most guidelines, which is around the desirable health effects and undesirable health effects, quality of evidence, etc. But I wanted to highlight a couple of different ones which I thought are particularly relevant for lower resource settings. One is around resource requirements, so costs. The other one is around health equity. And then there's a question around acceptability as well as feasibility as well. So it's taking a very comprehensive approach in looking at these recommendations. So we will be releasing the recommendations for public comment in the next months. But I can show you some of the PICO questions that these recommendations will cover. So for Azathioprine, there was not a lot of evidence available. And so we only made, or the panel only made recommendations for 2 PICO questions. One was around Azathioprine versus no DMTs in relapsing forms of MS as first choice treatment. And the other one was Azathioprine versus other DMTs for relapsing forms of MS as first choice treatment. For this one, there was only data available for interferon, so that PICO question is focused on looking at the difference between Azathioprine and interferon. We didn't have enough evidence to look at switching in relapsing forms of MS, and again, not enough evidence to look at progressive forms of MS. So for Rituximab, there was more evidence available, and the panel were able to consider most of the PICO questions that were put forward at the beginning. We looked at both relapsing forms of MS as well as progressive forms of MS. We looked at no DMTs as well as other DMTs. And then we also looked at first choice treatment versus switching. There was only one PICO questions that the panel didn't feel comfortable that there was enough evidence to make a recommendation. And this was around progressive forms of MS as first choice treatment for Rituximab versus other DMTs. Just to mention a little bit more about our process here as well. So first of all, we have the MOLT panel, which consists of 17 different members. The members are from 14 different countries and 6 different WHO regions. Where it's multidisciplinary. We have people with MS, we have neurologists, nurses, psychologists, MS organizations, methodologists, pharmaceutical and regulatory policy experts, as well as pharmacists represented. They made the recommendations, but then we also closely consulted with what we call the tier 1 stakeholders. So this includes the World Federation of Neurology, regional neurological academies, regional TRIMS, the different WHO departments, as well as our internal groups, such as our medical and scientific board and our international working group on access. And we also identified some experts who we knew were kind of using these DMTs in clinical practice at a scale. So these were from India as well as from Sweden. Sweden uses Rituximab quite widely. We then also have the second ring of different stakeholders, which is the wider MS community, and we will also be opening up the recommendations for open public comment. So just to show you where we are sitting in terms of the process, we have now got the draft recommendations and we have completed our consultation with the key stakeholders. We will be opening up for public comment in the coming months. And then we will be producing the final recommendations, which will be published in a peer-reviewed journal. And then we will be working on dissemination and advocacy activities. So this brings me to the end of my presentation. I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and I would be very happy to take any questions. If there's not enough time for questions, please also do contact me by email.